In the distant, forgotten reaches of the galaxy, the planet Nisix was known for its cruelty and injustice. Among its most notorious landmarks stood the Pillar of Shame, a towering monument of suffering. This grim structure was a place where the most dangerous criminals and political prisoners were shackled, left to wither away under the harsh, unforgiving sun. Those who were placed there were often forgotten by the world, except for the whispers that circulated in dark corners, telling stories of the prisoners' pasts. Ariag Selka, once the fierce and fearless leader of the Korthian rebels, was one such prisoner. Her name had once been spoken with awe, a legend of defiance against the galactic oppressors. She had led countless raids, freed entire villages from tyrannical rulers, and inspired millions with her unyielding will. But that was before she was betrayed. The rebellion she had fought so hard to build turned against her, and her closest allies sold her out to the enemy. Now she was nothing more than a shadow of the woman she once was. Her once glorious armor, which had shimmered with the marks of victory, lay in ruins. Her long, silver hair was matted and tangled, her skin bruised and scarred from years of mistreatment. She was chained to the pillar, forced to endure the scorching sun and relentless storms without respite, while her mind struggled to hold on to the memories of her former strength. The people of Nisix had long since given up on her, but there were still those who whispered her name. Some remembered the legend of Ariag Selka, but those memories were slowly fading. She had become a symbol of failure, a cautionary tale for those who dared to rebel. Yet, deep within her, a flicker of defiance remained. It was faint, but it was there. Perhaps it always would be, no matter how much the chains tried to break her spirit. On the edge of the prison camp, a new prisoner arrived. His name was Alaric Volan. Alaric was a mercenary, a man whose life had been marked by tragedy. He had been framed for a crime he did not commit, betrayed by those who once called him a comrade. His reputation as a skilled fighter had earned him a place among the most dangerous men in the galaxy, but that did little to protect him from the treacherous hands of the authorities. Like many before him, he found himself thrown into Nisix's brutal prison system, far from any hope of escape. At first, Alaric's presence in the prison was nothing more than a whisper in the wind, but as the days passed, he heard the murmurs about Ariag Selka, the woman chained to the Pillar of Shame. Stories told of her might, of how she had once led an entire rebellion. Some said she had supernatural powers, while others spoke of her unmatched combat skills. There were even rumors that her chains couldn't hold her, that her spirit was too strong to be broken. Alaric, who had spent years fighting for freedom and justice, couldn't help but be intrigued. He didn't believe in the myths or the stories, but there was something about her name that caught his attention. One evening, when the prison had grown quiet, Alaric found himself standing near the Pillar of Shame. He gazed at the woman chained there, her figure hunched and broken, but there was something unmistakably fierce in her eyes. Even in her defeated state, she still radiated power. It was as if her body had given up, but her soul refused to. Ariag Selka was still alive, and somewhere within her, there was still the spark of the warrior who had once burned bright. Alaric couldn't look away. Something inside him stirred. A sense of justice, of wanting to help, to free the woman who had been left to rot. But for now, he could do nothing but watch. Alaric Volan had spent the first few days of his imprisonment in silence, observing his new surroundings. The prison on Nisix was a place where hope went to die. Its vast, barren landscape stretched endlessly, with the Pillar of Shame standing as the darkest reminder of what awaited those who dared to defy the system. The atmosphere was thick with despair, and the prison itself was more like a fortress than a place for rehabilitation. Alaric, a man hardened by years of battle, knew all too well that survival was a game of patience and cunning. Still, as the days passed, one name kept echoing in his mind: Ariag Selka. He had heard the whispers in the prison corridors, passed along by the prisoners who had once heard of her legend. The Korthian firebrand. Some called her the heart of the rebellion. Stories of her bravery, her strength, and her leadership abilities had spread throughout the galaxy. She had been the spark that ignited the rebellion against the oppressors. But now, she was just another broken woman chained to a pillar. Alaric didn't believe all the stories, of course. After all, he had seen how rumors grew into myths. But something about her fate troubled him. A woman like Aria, a woman who had led armies and taken on entire fleets, was not someone who deserved to be left to rot on a desolate planet. He had heard the guards talk about her from time to time, as though she were nothing more than a piece of history to be forgotten. She was one of them, one guard had said. The rebels thought they could change the galaxy. Now look at her. She's a prisoner like the rest of us. Alaric hadn't understood the full meaning of those words until he had seen her with his own eyes. There, chained to the pillar of shame, was a woman who had once commanded armies, who had once fought for freedom, but who now looked as if she had given up. The sight of her, hunched over and exhausted, struck something deep inside Alaric. He didn't know why it bothered him so much. He didn't even know her, but the idea of her suffering like that felt wrong. It wasn't that Alaric was a knight in shining armor. He wasn't a man who went around saving people without cause. He had his own reasons for being in the prison, reasons that still haunted him. But as he watched Aria, something stirred within him, a feeling of kinship, a shared understanding of loss and betrayal. He had been wronged by those he had trusted, just like she had been. He had been thrown into this hellhole for a crime he didn't commit, just as she had been locked away for her supposed failures. He didn't know what had happened to her, why she had ended up in this place, but he knew that there had to be more to her story than just a failed rebellion. Alaric's curiosity grew each day. He couldn't shake the thought of her. Even though the guards kept their distance from the pillar, Alaric found himself lingering in the shadows, watching her from afar. He knew that she was still alive and more than just body. Her eyes held something powerful, a fire that refused to go out. It was a fire that reminded him of his own need for revenge, his desire to make those who had wronged him pay. And perhaps, just perhaps, if she could fight back against the chains that held her, he could find a way to do the same. As the days passed, Alaric made a decision. He couldn't just stand by and watch. He would find a way to free her. He wasn't sure how he would do it, or if it was even possible, but he knew one thing. HFY didn't belong here. No one, not even the most broken of warriors, deserved to be chained like this, in the depths of the prison. Among the prisoners who had long since given up hope, Alaric Volan made an unspoken vow to free the woman who had once been a legend. And in doing so, he would find his own path to redemption. The prison was silent that night, save for the soft whispers of the wind across the barren plains of Nisix. Alaric Volan lay awake in his cell, the dim light of the prison's weak moon casting long shadows across the walls. He couldn't sleep. His mind raced with the thought of HFY, the woman chained to the pillar of shame. For days, he had been watching her from a distance, unable to shake the image of her, a warrior broken by time, betrayal, and relentless torment. He had decided, in the deepest part of his soul, that he couldn't stand by any longer. He had to do something. The feeling gnawed at him, pulling him toward action. Aria's fate was tied to something far bigger than just her imprisonment. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the galaxy. If he could somehow free her, perhaps there was a chance for something more than just survival. As the hours passed, Alaric's mind ran through every detail of the prison he had observed over the past few days. He had studied the guards' patrols, memorized their routines, and noted every weak point in the security system. The prison was heavily fortified, no doubt about it. But Alaric was no stranger to escape plans. He had escaped worse situations before, though he had never felt such a pull to rescue someone as he did now. But this wasn't just about the woman herself. It was about what she represented. A rebellion lost, a spirit unbroken, a symbol of the fight for freedom. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The guards were too many, and the prison's technology too advanced. He would need help, but the prisoners were too afraid to risk anything. No one dared to challenge the system. It was a place built to crush hope, to ensure that even the strongest were left broken. But Alaric didn't believe in that. He refused to believe that anyone, even someone like Arya, had lost all hope. The next day, he found himself standing near the Pillar of Shame again. His heart raced as he approached, trying not to make a sound. The air around the pillar felt heavy, thick with the pain and the ghosts of countless souls who had been trapped in the same hell. He could see her now, her form slumped against the pillar, her chains glinting under the harsh light. Her eyes were closed, but her chest rose and fell with each breath, slow, steady, but filled with exhaustion. Alaric's heart pounded. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. Stepping closer, he whispered her name, unsure if she could even hear him. Arya Xelka. For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and they locked onto his. The moment their gazes met, something shifted. For the briefest second, Alaric could see the glimmer of recognition in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced with suspicion. She had been betrayed before, by her own people, by her allies, and she was no fool. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, but the edge of authority still lingered in it. "I'm not here to hurt you," Alaric said quickly. "I'm here to help you." Arya's eyes narrowed. "Help me? And why would you do that? What do you want from me?" "I want nothing from you," Alaric replied, his voice steady. "I've been watching you. I know who you are. You're Arya Xelka, the leader of the rebellion, and I'm here to set you free." For a long moment, Arya said nothing. Her gaze remained fixed on him, as if trying to read him, to understand whether he was just another fool who had come to waste her time. But then, something in her expression softened, just a little. It was barely noticeable, but Alaric saw it. "You think you can free me?" she asked, her voice laced with both disbelief and a hint of something else, something like hope buried deep beneath the surface. "I don't think," Alaric said. "I know. I've studied this prison. I know the weaknesses. You're not going to be left here any longer. I'm getting you out." There was a long pause as Arya seemed to contemplate his words. Finally, she nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Then get to it," she muttered. "I've been waiting long enough." And in that moment, Alaric realized that, despite her broken appearance, despite everything she had been through, Arya Xelka was not defeated. She was still a warrior at heart. She had just been waiting for someone to come along and remind her of that. Alaric didn't know how he was going to do it, but with her by his side, they would find a way. Together, they would break free from this prison, and nothing would stand in their way. Alaric and Arya made their way through the shadows of Nisix's prison complex, moving as silently as the night itself. Their escape had begun in earnest. Arya, despite her time chained to the Pillar of Shame, still possessed the sharp mind and tactical brilliance that had once made her the leader of a rebellion feared throughout the galaxy. Her instincts, honed over years of combat and resistance, had not dulled, even after years of suffering. Alaric had been right. She wasn't broken. She was just waiting for the right moment to rise again. As they navigated the dark, narrow corridors of the prison, Arya's voice broke the silence. "We can't trust anyone here. They're all either too scared or too loyal to the system to help us. If we're going to escape, it's on us." Alaric nodded, his face set in determination. He had always known that survival meant trusting no one, but something about Arya's resolve made him feel a surge of confidence. He had studied the prison for days, watching the guards and memorizing their routines. But even with all his preparation, the escape still felt too risky. Yet with Arya at his side, it felt possible. Her presence was a reminder that they could make it, if they were smart enough, if they were quick enough. "Do you have a plan?" Alaric asked as they crept along a hallway, avoiding the faint glow of the security lights. Arya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Then, in a low voice, she spoke. "There's a service tunnel near the south wall. I know it well. I used it during the last raid, years ago. It leads to a small outpost. From there, we can find a ship and leave this place behind." Alaric felt a surge of relief. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was something. And it gave them a direction, a way out. They continued moving, every step measured, every sound a threat. The prison's guards were on high alert, and Alaric could feel the weight of their eyes on him even when they weren't near. But Arya was quick, always one step ahead, guiding him through the labyrinth of corridors like a shadow. As they reached the service tunnel, Arya paused, signaling for Alaric to stop. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening intently. "We have company," she muttered, her voice tight with tension. Alaric didn't hesitate. He pulled Arya into a small alcove, just as a group of guards passed by, their heavy boots echoing off the metal floors. Alaric's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breathing steady, his mind focused. He knew that if they were caught now, everything would be over. He couldn't let that happen, not after everything they had been through. The guards passed without noticing them, and Arya let out a silent breath of relief. "That was too close," she whispered. Alaric gave a small, wry smile. "You're not the only one who can stay out of sight." They continued down the tunnel, moving with a quiet urgency. The walls of the passage were narrow, but it wasn't long before they reached the end, an old rusted hatch that led to the outside. Arya worked quickly, using the small device she had hidden in the folds of her tattered clothing to unlock the hatch. With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing the barren, windswept plains of Nisix stretching out before them. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. But the sight of the open world beyond the prison's walls brought a surge of freedom to Alaric's chest. They were so close now, just a few more steps, and they would be out of this hellhole. Arya looked at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes shone with something new. Hope. "We're almost there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close. We can't afford any more mistakes." Alaric nodded, his gaze never leaving her. He had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't expected. There was something about Arya that made him believe they could do this. Even in the darkest moments, she had a way of making things seem possible. Together, they stepped into the night, leaving the prison behind them. The wind howled in their ears, but to Alaric, it was the sound of freedom, of a future that, for the first time in years, didn't seem out of reach. But they weren't safe yet. Their journey had just begun, and the path ahead would be filled with danger. Still, with Arya by his side, Alaric felt ready to face whatever came next. They had survived this far. They could survive anything. Alaric and Arya had only just stepped into the cold night air when the sound of distant alarms began to echo from the heart of the prison. Their escape had not gone unnoticed. The guards would soon be on high alert, and the entire facility would be searching for them. They didn't have much time. Without speaking, they both broke into a run, their feet pounding against the harsh terrain of Nisix's barren plains. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the scent of dust and scorched earth. Arya's eyes were scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. She had led armies before, but this was different. They were alone now, with no backup, no allies. It was just the two of them against an entire planet full of enemies. But Arya had learned to trust in her instincts, and right now, her instincts told her they could make it. They had to. Alaric kept pace with her, his breath coming in steady bursts. He had always been a good fighter, skilled with a blade, sharp with his instincts. But even he knew this wasn't just about combat. They had to be smart, and they had to stay ahead of the guards who would soon be hunting them down. "Where's the ship?" he asked, his voice urgent. Arya didn't slow down, her eyes still locked on the horizon. "About 2 miles east. It's an old ship, nothing fancy, but it'll do the job. We'll have to get there without being spotted. The path's risky, but it's the quickest route. Alaric nodded. He didn't question her plan. He trusted her instincts just as much as she trusted his. They had already survived the impossible by escaping the prison. Now they just needed to survive long enough to reach the ship. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and the landscape seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Every so often, Arya would glance over her shoulder, her sharp gaze scanning for any signs of pursuit. "Keep your head down," she muttered. "We don't want to give them any reason to catch up." They pressed on, their muscles aching with the effort, but neither of them slowed. The adrenaline of their escape kept them moving, the promise of freedom just beyond reach. As they neared the edge of a large rock formation, Alaric suddenly heard the distant sound of engines, a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. The patrols were already mobilizing. The ship they were heading for was their only hope, but it was in a desolate part of the landscape, surrounded by jagged cliffs and treacherous terrain. It wasn't the kind of place that was easy to approach undetected. Alaric's heart raced as he considered the options. "We can't outrun them on foot," he said, his voice tense. "We need another way." Arya's eyes narrowed as she scanned their surroundings. Then, without a word, she motioned for him to follow her as she led them toward a narrow ravine between two large boulders. The path was steep, rocky, and barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but it would take them off the main path and out of sight of the guards. Alaric hesitated for only a moment, then followed her, trusting her judgment. The ravine was dark and treacherous, the walls on either side towering over them. The air was thick with dust, and every step felt precarious. But Arya moved with the grace of someone who knew these lands intimately, her movements calculated and precise. She didn't look back, her focus entirely on the path ahead. Alaric followed her lead, his mind racing as he thought of the approaching patrols. It wasn't long before the sound of the engines grew louder, and Alaric could see the searchlights sweeping across the plains in the distance. They were getting closer. Arya's pace quickened as she led them deeper into the ravine, her sharp eyes constantly darting from side to side. They had to stay ahead, just a little longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of scrambling through rocks and uneven terrain, they reached the end of the ravine. There, hidden among the rocks, was the old ship Arya had mentioned. It wasn't much to look at. Its hull was battered, and its paint had long since chipped away, but it was functional. It was their ticket out of Nisix. "We're almost there," Arya said, her voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Alaric nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. They had made it this far. Now they just had to get the ship airborne. But before they could reach the hatch, a shout echoed from behind them. "Stop right there!" Alaric's blood ran cold. The guards had found them. But there was no turning back now. Without a word, Alaric and Arya dashed toward the ship, their feet pounding against the ground, the sound of pursuit closing in fast. The fight for their freedom had only just begun. Alaric and Arya reached the ship just as the first of the guards appeared at the edge of the ravine, their footsteps echoing against the rocks. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, and time was running out. Arya reached the hatch first, slamming her hand against the control panel. The door hissed open, but it wasn't fast enough. Alaric could hear the guards shouting now, and he didn't need to look over his shoulder to know that they were closing in. "Get inside," Arya shouted as she ducked into the ship, pulling her cloak tightly around her. Alaric wasted no time, jumping into the cockpit and slamming the hatch behind him. The ship's control panels flickered to life as he quickly engaged the systems, his fingers dancing across the buttons and levers. The engines roared, and the ship's hull vibrated beneath them. He could feel the pulse of energy as the engines warmed up, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The guards were almost upon them, and they had to lift off before they were caught. "Arya," Alaric shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. "We need to go now." Arya was already at the rear of the ship, her hands moving quickly as she checked the rear security system. "They're too close," she muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to create a diversion." Alaric didn't hesitate. He pulled back on the throttle, the ship lifting off the ground with a violent jolt. The sound of the engines filled the air as the vessel shot upwards, climbing rapidly toward the sky. He could see the flashing lights of the search parties below, and he knew they had only moments before they were spotted. Aria was quick to act. She moved to a nearby console and pressed a few buttons. Suddenly, the ship's external weapon systems hummed to life. The small, outdated ship wasn't equipped for a full-scale battle, but it had just enough firepower to cause some chaos. A series of small, controlled explosions erupted in the distance, the bright bursts of light obscuring their departure. "That should buy us a little time," Aria said as she returned to the cockpit, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "But it won't last long. We need to get out of the planet's atmosphere." Alaric nodded, his fingers flying over the controls as he steered the ship toward the stars. The ship wasn't the fastest, but it was maneuverable enough to avoid the enemy's fire. The air outside the ship began to thin as they climbed higher, and Alaric's heart raced. They were so close, but the feeling of being hunted, the sense that they were only moments away from being caught, was suffocating. The ship shook violently as the first shots from the prison's defense systems hit their hull. The ship's shields flared to life, absorbing the impact, but Alaric could feel the tremors reverberate through the controls. "Hold on," Alaric shouted as he pulled the ship into a sharp roll, narrowly avoiding another barrage of fire. The stars outside the windows streaked by in a blur as they soared higher, leaving the planet's dangerous surface behind. But even as they ascended, the pursuit was relentless. The prison's automated systems had detected their escape, and the sky was filled with the flashing lights of enemy ships closing in on them. Alaric could see the outline of a large fleet forming in the distance, their weapons locked onto the small ship. "We need to lose them," Alaric said through gritted teeth, his fingers tightening around the control panel. "Aria, what do we do now?" Aria didn't hesitate. "We're heading for the asteroid field just outside the system. It's our only chance." Alaric immediately altered the course, veering sharply toward the dense asteroid field. The ship's engines roared as they made the perilous jump, hurtling toward the jagged rocks and debris that littered the void. The ship shook again as another round of fire pounded against their shields. As they entered the field, the ship's sensors began to flicker with static, the interference from the asteroids making it harder to navigate. But Aria's experience guided them through, her sharp instincts honed over years of surviving against the odds. "Just a little further," she muttered, her voice tense. "We need to get deep inside the field. It's the only place they won't follow us." Alaric's eyes were locked on the chaos of the asteroid field ahead. It was their last hope. The enemy was relentless, but so was Aria. Together, they could escape, but it was going to take everything they had to survive. The small ship plunged deeper into the darkness, weaving between the massive asteroids, hoping that the shadows would be enough to hide them from the enemy's sight. The sound of enemy fire echoed in the distance, but the silence of the asteroid field was their only chance. Alaric and Aria dove deeper into the asteroid field, their ship twisting and turning through the maze of floating rocks. The engine screamed as the ship barely avoided a massive asteroid, its jagged surface just inches from the hull. The ship's shields flickered, absorbing the constant bombardment of debris as they pushed forward. Alaric's hands gripped the controls tightly, his focus locked on the path ahead. He could hear the faint hum of the enemy ships behind them, still in pursuit, but the dense field of asteroids was starting to work in their favor. The enemy's larger, slower ships couldn't maneuver as well in the field, and the smaller fighter crafts weren't built for the kind of high-speed dodging they were doing. "Stay on this course, Alaric." Aria's voice cut through the tense silence in the cockpit. "We need to keep the pressure on them. The field will confuse their tracking systems, but we can't afford to slow down." Alaric didn't need any more convincing. He pushed the throttle forward, sending the ship spiraling around another asteroid. His heart raced as he navigated through the labyrinth of space rocks, his senses heightened, every movement calculated. He could feel the weight of the decision to trust Aria's plan. But deep down, he knew she was right. The asteroid field was their only chance to escape. The enemy would be relentless, but Aria had proven time and time again that she knew how to survive when everything seemed against her. Just a little more, Alaric muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. The ship shook violently as another enemy blast hit their shields. Alaric's teeth clenched, but he didn't let up. He needed to push forward. Aria was moving around the back of the ship, working on the defense systems, checking every panel, making sure they were ready for whatever was coming. "How much longer until we're through?" Alaric called out, his voice tight. "We need to get deep inside." Aria responded, her tone focused. "The longer we stay on the edge of the field, the more likely it is they'll catch up. We need to lose them completely." Alaric nodded, his eyes scanning the chaos around them. The asteroid field was dense and disorienting, a maze of floating rocks of all sizes, with flashes of enemy fire lighting up the darkness. But the further they went, the fewer enemy ships followed. They were losing their pursuers, at least for now. Suddenly, a large shadow loomed ahead, and Alaric barely had time to react as a massive asteroid rocketed toward them. The ship groaned under the pressure as he yanked the controls to the left, narrowly missing the rock. The enemy wasn't far behind, but Alaric's heart thudded in his chest, knowing that every second they spent in the field brought them closer to safety. "Hold on," Alaric shouted as he spiraled the ship downward, dodging another barrage of fire from a distant enemy fighter. The controls jerked in his hands as the ship dived lower into the asteroid field, weaving between enormous space boulders. His breath came in short bursts, his mind racing with the intensity of the chase. If they could just lose their enemies in the maze of rocks, they'd have a chance. There, Aria pointed toward a narrow gap between two large asteroids, barely wide enough for the ship to fit through. "That'll take us deeper into the field. Follow my lead." Without a second thought, Alaric adjusted the ship's course, racing toward the gap. The rocks loomed larger as they neared, and for a moment, it seemed impossible to fit through. But Alaric trusted Aria. He pushed the throttle forward, taking the ship into the narrow opening. The ship scraped against the sides of the asteroids, the hull groaning as the metal scraped against the jagged surfaces, but they made it through. The enemy ships, unable to follow, had been left behind. "We're in," Aria said, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. She collapsed back into the seat beside him, wiping sweat from her brow. Alaric exhaled sharply, his heart still racing, but he couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips. That was too close. Aria chuckled, despite the tension still hanging in the air. "You get used to it. But we're not out yet. We still need to find a way off this system without attracting attention." Alaric nodded, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the ship's sensors. The asteroid field stretched out before them, and though the enemy was no longer in immediate pursuit, the dangers were far from over. They still had to navigate their way through the field, find a way to make it past the security systems, and finally escape into open space. But for now, they had a brief moment of peace. The chase had stopped. They had outsmarted their enemies, for the time being. And that was enough. The ship glided deeper into the asteroid field, its engines humming steadily as the chaotic sounds of pursuit faded into silence. Alaric kept his eyes on the controls, his fingers lightly tapping the buttons, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew they had managed to slip away, but the real challenge was far from over. Aria had made it clear, escaping the prison was only the first step. Now, they had to survive. Aria sat beside him, watching the flashing sensors on the console. Her face was etched with concentration, but there was an underlying weariness in her eyes. She had been through countless battles, faced near death more times than she cared to remember. But this escape, it was different. It was personal. She knew their enemies wouldn't stop until they were captured or dead. She also knew that if they made one wrong move, everything they had just fought for would come crashing down. "How long until we can break free of the field?" Alaric asked, his voice low and steady. Arya glanced at the monitors, analyzing the data as the ship continued its path through the twisting rock formations. "We still have a while," she said, tapping a few buttons to adjust their trajectory. "The deeper we go, the more difficult it will be for them to track us. But we need to stay hidden. The longer we stay here, the better." Alaric nodded but couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. They had dodged their pursuers for now, but that didn't mean they were safe. The asteroid field was an unpredictable place. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they could be trapped. Worse yet, their enemies were relentless. Alaric knew it would only be a matter of time before they regrouped and sent reinforcements. As they navigated through the maze of asteroids, Alaric's mind wandered back to their escape. He remembered the sound of the prison alarms blaring as they ran through the narrow corridors, the tension in the air as Arya led him toward the ship. Everything had happened so fast. They had been so close to being caught. If it hadn't been for Arya's quick thinking and unshakable resolve, they would never have made it out. But even as they fought to survive, Alaric couldn't ignore the growing bond between them. Arya had become more than just an ally. She was someone he could trust with his life. Someone who had been there, through the thick of it, every step of the way. He had seen her lead, seen her fight with fierce determination, but there was a quiet strength to her as well. "Hey," he said, breaking the silence. "Thanks for getting us out of there." Arya didn't look up, her attention focused on the ship's navigation system, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I don't plan on getting caught anytime soon." Alaric chuckled. "I think you're right. Still, we wouldn't have made it without you." Arya paused for a moment, considering his words. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her, the constant pressure of leading them to safety. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about staying free. And that was a much harder task than any battle she had ever fought. "We're not out of the woods yet," she said, her voice steady but with an edge of determination. "We can't afford to relax. Once we're clear of the field, we'll have to make our next move, and we need to be ready for anything." Alaric nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He knew she wasn't just talking about the immediate threat. She was thinking ahead, planning for the future. And he was right there with her, ready to face whatever came next. The ship continued its slow, careful path through the asteroid field, the occasional thrum of the engines filling the otherwise silent cockpit. Both Alaric and Arya knew that their fight was far from over. There were still enemies to face, still dangers to navigate. But for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope. They had made it this far, and together they would keep fighting, no matter what came next. The asteroid field finally began to thin, and Alaric could feel the tension in the air start to ease. The ship had been navigating the twisting maze for hours, but now, with the asteroids becoming sparse and distant, the horizon seemed to open up before them. Arya had been quietly monitoring the scanners, her eyes flicking from one readout to the next, ensuring they weren't being followed. Despite their successful escape, she knew that the real danger was just beginning. The universe was a vast, unforgiving place, and they weren't the only ones hunting for a way out. "We're clear," Arya said, her voice breaking the silence. She leaned back in her seat, letting out a long breath. For now, at least. Alaric's grip on the controls loosened slightly as he exhaled in relief. The feeling of escape, of finally being free from the prison that had held them, was overwhelming. But it was fleeting. He knew that their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. The authorities had been after Arya for years, and he was just another obstacle in their way. There was no telling how long it would take for them to regroup and come after them again. "What's next?" Alaric asked, glancing over at Arya. "We find somewhere safe," Arya replied, her voice steady. "We can't keep running forever. We'll need a place to lay low and figure out what to do next." Alaric nodded, understanding the need for caution. The ship wasn't equipped for long journeys through deep space, and their resources were running low. They needed to find a place to regroup, a safe haven where they could rest and plan. But where? The galaxy was vast, and the chances of finding a hidden sanctuary were slim. Still, they had to try. "There's a system a few parsecs away," Arya said, tapping a few coordinates into the navigation console. "It's a remote mining colony. Not much traffic, not many questions asked. It's the kind of place we can blend in, get some supplies, and figure out our next move." Alaric studied the coordinates for a moment, considering their options. It was a risk, but it was the best chance they had. He set a course for the colony, and the ship's engines hummed to life once again, pulling them away from the asteroid field and into the vast expanse of space. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for now, it felt like they were on the right path. As the stars stretched out before them, Alaric found his thoughts drifting. He thought of the prison, the harsh walls, the constant surveillance, the days that blurred together. He thought of Arya, who had been trapped there far longer than he could imagine, fighting tooth and nail for every scrap of freedom. She had led them through impossible odds, and now they were free, together. "What happens after we get to the colony?" Alaric asked, breaking the silence. Arya didn't look up immediately, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the console. When she did, her eyes met his with a look of quiet determination. "We keep moving. This is only the beginning, Alaric. The authorities will be searching for us everywhere, and it won't be long before someone catches up." Alaric met her gaze and nodded. She was right, of course. The authorities wouldn't stop until they had found Arya. But that didn't matter now. They had time to plan, time to think, and for the first time in a long while, Alaric felt a sense of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He turned his attention back to the stars ahead, the darkness of space stretching endlessly before them. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: they were stronger together. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. And for that moment, that was enough. The rest could wait. They had earned this brief respite. As the ship continued its journey toward the mining colony, the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the shared understanding that they were no longer just survivors. They were free, and they would do whatever it took to stay that way.